Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Afterburn Podcast. I'm Flash McVay. I'm here, honored to be here with Curly Pence. As we talked about in the introduction and in the first episode with our Vietnam Weasels, we're doing a evolution of SEAD month. This is part 2 of our series, and today we're going to be talking about Operation Desert Storm. And like I said, these weasels are my heroes. I've been doing the weasel thing for the majority of my career. And these are the guys I look up to in the history of the mission and the organization, and the people that are highly trained and specialized in this mission are the people that I've looked up to and want to learn from. Keeping that weasel spirit alive is why we're doing this. So this is going to be a fun day today. I've been looking forward to it for a few weeks now. Met Curly on an F-35 tour with his daughter Raven, who's our intel patch at Hill, who does an amazing job and is a weasel in her own right. But thank you to all of our supporters. And then we're going to kind of get with this. So, Curly, over to you. Intros. How'd you get commissioned? Pilot training, and then just kind of getting into up to being a weasel in Desert Storm.
Well, I was very lucky. I got accepted into the class of 83 at the Air Force Academy. Did my 4 years there, got a degree in engineering, graduated, went straight to pilot training down in Del Rio by the Sea. Had a great time with a great group of guys down there. When we weren't in there flying, we were out at the lake water skiing and drinking beer. Came around near the end of the program and put in for fighters first. So F-16, F-15, F-4 was my third choice. And on drop night, I got a F-4E model. Another guy in the class actually got an F-4E model, and a week later they changed it to an RF-4 because he put RF-4 in front of F-4. So I walked out of there with one of 5 fighters we got in our class, and then went down to Homestead, trained in the F-4D model, and then straight to Korea for one tour for a year in a air-to-air squadron, a short time at Moody before they got rid of the F-4s and went to F-16s. And out of Moody, they sent me to Weasel training. I had 500 hours in the F-4. You needed, as a front seater, you had to have experience because at that time they called it the F-4G Advanced Wild Weasel over what they had in the C model, F-4C model. And so I did the training there and then straight to Clark Air Base for 2 years. I flew at Clark for 2 years, and right as the tour was ending in I was supposed to PCS in September, actually in August, and August 2nd, they Iraq had invaded Kuwait. And when I was working my assignment a few months prior, I had told the assignments guy, hey, there's a little one-line clause in the PCS regulations that if you volunteer to go from overseas to overseas, they got to honor. So I had volunteered to go to Spangalum. And Spangalum, by the time I got there, had already sent some wild weasels to the theater. And then when I got there, they sent the rest, and I went straight down to Bahrain for that. So that's how the graduation, fighters, and getting down to the desert for Desert Storm.
Perfect. Lots it's great. In our kind of pre-pod recording discussion and just our time on the bar, in common, also went to Del Rio, also went to Moody, like myself in the A-10. So all these places that you were discussing kind of going through your career were similar in my experiences. So it was really cool to kind of sit down and talk to you guys about you and your family about the entire thing. So, as you go in, coming out of pilot training and then the actual like weasel training, did you want the F-4? Was that something were you drawn to the weasel mission? Did you know about it prior? Is that something that you wanted, or is that something that just kind of was luck of the draw at the end after you wanted fighters?
That's an excellent question. Where I did not know anything about wild weasels prior to pilot training or in pilot training, and I just knew F-4s, they had, like dinosaurs, roamed the earth and had been around since Vietnam. And I watched all of the Vietnam conflict growing up as a kid at 5 o'clock when my dad watched the nightly news. And back then, Walter Cronkite and those kind of reporters gave you on the scene for about 10 minutes every night. So you saw F-4s. There was a kid in my second grade class. His dad was shot down in mid-65 and was a POW. He was a Navy fighter pilot. And we moved away from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We're living in Texas. But my mom watched that when they got repatriated and watched him get off the plane. So she still tells that story today. I didn't know anything about the Weasels, but when I finished F4D training, the instructors in the F4 course were saying, stay away from the Weasel, stay away from the Weasel. They didn't say why, they just said, stay away. But after doing air to air was great. Air to ground, you flew the black line. Back then, it was hit the TOT plus or minus 1 minute. And everything was graded to the TOT. So you flew a straight line. Where they said there was few assignments to stay fighter out of Moody, and that's how I got into the Weasel, was to stay in the F4. It was that or possibly go to a white jet. I would much rather fly fighters anywhere. So it was a great deal staying operational. Went over back to PACAF. My first tour was in PACAF. And I tell you, that time in the 90th with the Diceman flying for 2 years, we had an excellent squadron commander there, Bucks Walters, and he trained to fight. So that when our mission was to go to North Korea, not a lot of SAMs up there, a couple SA2s and an SA5, but they knew we were coming, and they knew we were going to knock a hole in their systems. And even the generals in PACAF paraded in that squadron for the 90th. So being there and training with those guys, great group of men, and very hard on the brief, hard on the mission, and harder in the debrief to refine being where you needed to be. It was interesting back then with the Weasel mission at 88 to 90. HARM was a good missile, but for some reason we still trained a lot with Mavericks and Shrikes. When we did get to Desert Storm, we predominantly carried the HARM until late in the war, and somebody got a bright idea. Hey, let's get those Shrikes out. The guys were carrying Shrikes, and a Shrike had a very, very limited frequency band, and you had to have the right missile for the right frequency band, or you couldn't shoot a Shrike. And they started carrying them up there, and they said, these things, we can't, fire them because we're in the wrong frequency band. Give us back our HARM. So after about 3 or 4 days at the end of Desert Storm, they downloaded those and realized the F4G Advanced Wild Weasel with a HARM was the best way to go to provide all the other airplanes in the air the best coverage. And there was a lot of missions where we were either limited, we'd been there and left, and then the system turned on when we ran out of gas, and the strikers learned to say Magnum, just like they were a true Weasel. And those, if they were set it on an open freak, those Iraqis, their little sphincter clammed up, and they hit the off switch faster than you could turn on a flashlight. So it was an interesting thing that we all learned, both strikers and Weasels.
Oh man. Yeah, I was going to ask about that during the Desert Storm time, like the obviously carrying a certain amount of weapons, and then what do you do when there's more threats than weapons at times? And kind of some of the stories about just everything, if it's on an open freak, just saying Magnum, and then the intimidation factor. That's something that we heard about, like we got and were told about in part 1 in the Vietnam War, was towards the end of the conflict in Vietnam, was the North Vietnamese, just the intimidation factor of knowing that we now had a capability to find and kill SAMs, that they were less apt to actually accomplish their mission of shooting down pilots and shooting down aircraft. Is the fact of just being present is a deterrent in and of itself, and just being highly trained in the Weasels and knowing that if something turns on and we're there, then more than likely we're going to end up coming out on top. Is you might take a few shots at us, but it's coming right back at you. And you guys were, as we found, a little bit better than the other side in this one. But yeah, no, that's all. As far as the strike, I'll jump forward and then come on back. But the strike missile, the AGM-45, and so the first overall anti-radiation missile that the Air Force put on the Weasels, is that you went out with just like, it was preloaded with a frequency band that you could not change, and it wasn't very wide.
There were 3 strikes that maintenance had to choose from. And a lot of times, if you knew your mission and knew what area of the AOR you were going to go to, so what threats were in that small little corner of an AOR, then you could load up the correct strike. If you didn't have the correct strike for the correct threat array, then you had a weapon, but the weapon couldn't see the electrons being emitted. So it couldn't home in on that. So it was like an early day harm, but with a tiny frequency band. And so, you needed to carry 3 missiles to fire one to be able to cover the whole frequency band for what you might see out there. And so you had limited space under the wings and the center line to carry that wide array, which with the invention of the harm really, really advanced your capability in any theater. And it was just an interesting thing. So you talked about Vietnam with the SA-2. As long as the only thing that roamed the earth was the SA-2, you could carry a Shrike all day. If you went to North Korea, you could carry a Shrike. But when Desert Storm got ready to kick off, Saddam had been spending his oil money for years buying quite an array, both air-to-air and air-to-ground, of weapons. So he was loaded with 2s, 3s, 6s, and 8s for the SAM systems. And then he also had radar-guided AAA. So if you knew those frequency bands off the back of your hand, then you'd say, well, I'm going to need at least 3 different Shrikes. But when you only have, if you've got to carry fuel to get all the way deep into bad guy country, then you only got 2 hard points. And so now you're starting to limit yourself. So again, that's where the engineers went back to the drawing board and said, well, what can we do better? And so they built an 800-pound missile called the AGM-88 HARM. And that made the backseater in the F-4G Wild Weasel, his job a lot easier, because now our system could see all the threats, and then he could target it with the same weapon from A to B to Z, whatever showed up. So that was, again,
Love it.
A neat invention.
All right. So, no, that's awesome, man. I love talking about this stuff. But so that's because in North Korea, like when I'm an Osan guy, I know you were up at Daegu. Is it Daegu?
Daegu. K2.
But there you go. So I'm being down at Osan is like you got the North Korean, the DMZ all along there is still SA-2s, SA-5s. They definitely got some new stuff nowadays, but that's still predominantly the threat. And they brought the Weasel mission to the 36 back in 2014 when we kind of determined whether it would be feasible for like the Misawa guys to get over on night 1 of the next Korean conflict and started to train some of that stuff. But yeah, it's still kind of the same threats that we're talking about from Vietnam, same as the Nellis range, 2, 3, 6s, and 8s. But yeah, so some of these lessons learned, we're going up against some of the same threats in a lot of these conflict areas. And so obviously the lessons learned that you guys had is applicable kind of to the day. So as far as Weasel training, like when you actually went to the Weasel training course, where was that? That was at Moody, you were saying?
No, the Wild Weasel training course was taught at George Air Force Base. So back through the 80s.
What did that consist of?
It was a very formal training program. If you were an experienced crew member, it was a 2-month course. If you were a non-experienced crew member, and near the end of the F4 program, they started taking a little bit more non-experienced guys. It was a 4-month training program, 2-month or 4-month to go through it. But they taught you how that APR 38 originally, and then later it converted to an APR 47. They taught you every nut and bolt inside that and the electrons and how it worked in the displays. And then they went through that weapons array, the Maverick missile. So you find a SAM with the system, and then how you would then work to put the F-4G Wild Weasel into a position to attack and kill that. And of course, you're firing a Maverick at really short range, inside of his WES. So you're hoping he's emitting, but he's just doing it for show and doesn't have anything to fire at you, when there's no AAA sitting on his shoulder either, because you're getting in close. The Shrike, obviously, you're kind of mid-range in the harm. Then you can shoot that outside his WES, on the edge of his WES, or somewhere inside his WES. And it has more than just point at him and shoot. It's got a full 360 ability. So really a neat capability built in, again, to that missile. But it all varies based on your range to the system. But that's what they would train. And we trained.
Absolutely.
It was interesting. They would train guys back in the Wild F4 to fly at 100 feet. So prior to Desert Storm, the mission was you're going to have to get in there. And we were still doing the Vietnam. That was the one holdover from Vietnam was go in real low. And they wanted the Weasel to go in if it had to at 100 feet. That commander I was telling you about in the Philippines, he said, guys, if you think you're going to go into North Korea low, he said, think again. You're going to fly through so much hot lead, you're not coming home. You need to be able to do this mission at 20,000 feet. And so when we had a big ORI from PACAF, when we did that ORI, we did not fly low. We flew in the 20 to 24 block. That was our block built into the tasking. And when I went to Desert Storm, where were we? 24,000 on the ingress. So that guy really foresaw what was coming when we did that.
No, yeah, because that's another thing is it was kind of the thing towards the end of the Korean War. So Korean War and Vietnam, yes, we lost a lot. Or well, Vietnam, not the Korean War, but in Vietnam, we lost a considerable number of aircraft to the SAM, the SA-2, if you will. But 88% of it was from AAA. It was kind of executing 80% of aircraft lost was to AAA. It was, okay, we're going to execute a tactic that's going to keep us safe from the SAM, but now it's going to put us into this other threat environment that's been around since the invention of the gun. And that balance between the two is an incredibly interesting thing to look at, because I will tell you that over the evolution of SEAD to what we look at today is I haven't trained to a AAA threat, or we haven't trained to a AAA threat in a very long time. Is one, it's hard to train to, and then two, just a consideration of it is it's always a consideration, but it kind of gets scoffed. And that is an interesting situation where you guys are saying just like, hey, we're going to have to do this from medium altitude, which is going to put us in the wez of the thing we're trying to kill. But this kind of the best thing that we got to get done. So would you go through that with kind of your backseaters in the F4, that Weasel training? Was it hand in hand with the guys that were like with the EWOs, or was it separate, or like when did you guys like kind of come together? Was it right away? And did you guys get the exact same training?
Oh, we got the exact same training. You came together, and they didn't necessarily crew you like they did in the B course of a F4 or F-15E program, but eventually you ended up kind of being crewed the whole way through after some academics. So you ended up, you had Goose sitting next to you in the classroom, in the briefing room, and in the back of the jet. And the more you were crewed together with the same guy, the more you started to learn to talk in real short prose. You'd say working, and you would look at the scope, and you could see he was heads down while you're looking out front flying the jet. And he had to trust you. You weren't going to hit some rocks or another plane, but he could go heads down and work that system. And you would see moving a little diamond around the scope and then putting it on a system, and then watching the information on the scope refine and go to a high quality. And it might be at your right 2 o'clock, but when he said he was ready, if you looked over at the scope one more time and saw that diamond was still on that, what I would do is I told the backseater, my contract with him was I would turn and put that on the nose, and then we'd be cleared to fire. And we always worked with them so that the backseater actually got to fire the missile. So he knew what he had. He knew when he was really ready. And then he would hammer it. You pull it to the nose. That way the missile didn't have to do a lot of BFM to get to the target. It had a clear line of sight, all its energy going straight ahead. And bam, fire that missile. Quick war story in the middle of explaining this was we learned in the first 3 or 4 days of Desert Storm, you fire that missile, don't turn real quick after that thing comes off your wing, because there is a hard bit of air turbulence right close to your intake. And guys would start to turn right as that came off. And if they turned into that jet wash off the missile, they'd flame out a motor. And one time my backseater said, I want to see what this looks like coming off. And so I said, okay, when you fire, I'm going to start a turn. And so I'm forgetting what the other guys had told me. And so I started that turn, and next thing I know, plane was getting real sluggish. And we're right over bad guy country. And I looked at the airspeed's rolling back about 50, 60, 70 knots. I'm like, what the heck happened to the plane? And I looked at the motor, and all the needles are buried down on zero. I said, oh, flamed out a motor. So I just brought the throttle back across the hump, then pushed it back over, hit the button, it lit, and then as soon as it stabilized in mill, I put it in AB and accelerated and got out of there.
Hey, and since you did it, that's not an emergency. You guys keep flying. You're good.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't like it just stalled when you were doing an instrument approach or something. So, yeah, it was self-induced. The engine worked fine, so maintenance note.
Well, that's
press.
I was maybe a little sacrilegious, but some days maybe you pray to Weasel Jesus. That's why Weasel Jesus gave you 2 engines, and but
it's a wonderful thing.
Versus the Viper, it's a wonderful thing. Sometimes you need 2.
We enjoyed having that second engine.
Yeah, definitely. As I've flown 2 single engine, single engine, you're always looking at that, trying to determine when that thing's going to go. But after you've flown or 2, but all right. So now we're through Weasel training. You're a full up Weasel. It's interesting when you talk about the Air Force Academy that post Vietnam. Sorry to kind of add a question in here, but as I'm also as an academy grad, is like, did they talk about Vietnam in 1983? It wasn't that long ago when this was a thing, but was that part of any curriculum, like military studies or anything like that? Like it kind of shocks me a little bit that somebody within 10 years of the war being over, not really kind of hearing about like the actual tactics and things that you guys were doing in the conflict. Because when I went to the academy, that was discussed. Like we talked about individual things. There's a squadron in the 35th Cadet Squadron. That's the Weasels. But yeah, that's not something you guys talked about at the academy when you were a cadet?
There was a certain number of Vietnam veterans there. Our squadron, AOC for 18th Squadron, my very first year there as a dually, he was a 68 grad, and he had gone and flown O2 Bird Dogs and then later B-52s. But he had spent time over a year in Vietnam flying the Bird Dog. So when he walked, man, we stood tall around him. It was yes, sir, no, sir. And can you tell me something? Please, I want to hear it. There was an Army Ranger. And, man, when you saw that guy coming, boy, everybody stood tall, saluting. And they didn't wink at him, but they were his, yes, sir, we appreciate the service. And if you got time, tell us another war story. And one of my mentors there, had been in the Navy, and he'd been in the back seat of a 4-man crew. I don't know what aircraft. He never said the crew. He worked in Intel, so he was doing something in the back. I don't know if they were listening to transmissions and then writing stuff down. He spoke in numerous languages, Mike Flynn, but that plane got shot down by an SA-2, and he ejected from it, and he was the only crew member to survive. And they would tell you a couple of stories here and there, but you just never got a lot out of the men that had worked in Vietnam, flown combat. But you knew who the combat vets were on the faculty there, and you looked for them because you could read between the lines and say, especially for those who wanted to go into pilot training, try and go to fighters, those were your ones you wanted to be your mentors. Anybody can be a shoe clerk, but those are the guys, if that's what you wanted to do in life, they were the ones you wanted to learn how to square up your shoulders and put your head in the fight.
I completely agree. It's it's a similar experience. I've talked about it on a pod before, that I didn't appreciate. I didn't even know like what a weapons officer was or like anything like that. But my AOC at the academy was a weapons officer. He's a B1 guy, and man, I didn't appreciate him when I was a cadet. But then about like 2 years after I graduated, I looked back on it and I was just like, I kind of learned more about it and started studying on my own. And I now read about some of the things that he did in the early parts of the Iraq war and things like that. And I was just like, Oh, I actually had like a guy in my midst that I should have appreciated a lot more. So it's great to, yeah, you know who they are, and that's who you look up to. And as you kind of go through you try to emulate the people that you want to be around, and then you try to become them. So that's cool that you had some of those guys there at the academy. So, all right, so we're through again, full up Weasel round, and then like who was teaching that Weasel training? Was it the guy? Was some of the Vietnam vets still around, like doing the Weasel training in the F4? Was it a mix of like civilian kind of intel, or was it all the above? But were you flying with instructor EWOs or anything like that? How was that? Who was the actual instructors of that course?
We had instructors who had come from operational squadrons, from the Wild Weasel operational squadron. So you couldn't be an instructor in the schoolhouse if you hadn't flown as a Wild Weasel crew member in one of the operational Wild Weasel squadrons. And the Wild Weasel was limited in the Air Force even back in the 80s with the one squadron at PACAF, the 90th. George had two squadrons, the 561st and 563rd Wild Weasel fighter squadrons, and then the 562nd was the training squadron. And then over in Europe at Spangalum, they had three squadrons, always getting ready for the folded gap with the Russians coming across for the big one, and a lot of mobile SAMs they were expected for that war that fortunately never came to fruition. But they had three squadrons there, the 23rd, the 81st, and the 480th. And they flew mixed pair to spread out the advanced Wild Weasel. So each squadron had 12 F4Gs and then 12 F4E models. But to fly the F4G at those squadrons normally was a Weasel crew member because of the value of the plane and the training that was required to go through it in the first place. But back in the schoolhouse, to be an instructor in the 562nd, you had to come from one of those other six squadrons after a tour. You go to George and then be an instructor. So when I was leaving the Philippines, the squadron commander recommended me to go to George to the 562nd. But my goal was to try, by that point, I just finished my third operational assignment. And I thought, this operational stuff's where it's at. So I had already called NPC with him not knowing it, volunteered to go from operational to operational assignment. That's what ended up happening.
Well, there you go. Nice. All right. Well, then, and that's kind of taking us up into, just like you were saying, as you were leaving Weasel training was kind of the lead up to what date if you can remember, what day did you finish Weasel training and kind of get on to your next assignment?
I finished Weasel training the summer of '88, around July 16th. And finished up on that Friday. And then Saturday morning, a buddy from Moody was getting married in Vegas. So I drove up to Vegas and went to his wedding, and then took my truck back to Moody, left it with some friends, and then jumped on a plane and PCS to the Philippines, and then flew over there, like I said, for 2 years. And was very fortunate I was going back to the Weasel one way or the other, but I could have gone to the 562nd, but luckily NPC honored my request, and I got sent to Europe to Spangal.
Yep. And then say apologies. Yeah, you showed up to Spang. So you showed up to Spang, you said in 90.
Right. And the interesting thing for Desert Shield, Desert Storm was Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2nd. And my PCS month was August, but he said, I can get you to Spang if you can wait 1 month. And I said, sure. So he cut the orders in September for me to arrive no later than the first week of October for funding. So that way he could put the funding into the next fiscal year. So I PCS'd out of Clark with the bad guys already in Kuwait. Within about 10 days, they had drawn a line in the sand, and they had already started deploying crews. So they deployed the 561st Advanced Wild Weasel Fighter Squadron. They were some of the first jets in theater. Them and the F-15Cs were the first ones to go over. And they took the whole squadron. They took 24 jets to Bahrain Air Base or to Bahrain, to Sheikh Issa Air Base on the southern tip of the island of Bahrain. The F-15Cs from Langley, they went over to Dhahran. And when the guys got there out of George Air Force Base, all they had were coordinates. They flew around, nobody to talk to on the tower. The runway was clear, and they pitched out and landed. And then they slept under the wing of the plane that night from the 561st.
Oh, that's awesome. That's
yeah,
awesome.
It was really
well. And now, I mean, you're showing up in October of '90. So to kind of set the stage, we are now there. But to set the stage for listeners with Desert Storm. So Iran-Iraq war for about 8 years, going up into 80 to 88. And now coming out of that, Saddam Hussein is broke. He's broke, doesn't have any money, and kind of going into some of that. But so basically what he was kind of saying was, as part of OPEC with Kuwait, was Kuwait had funded a lot of the Iran-Iraq war for Saddam Hussein. So now when they're coming back, Kuwait is trying to ask Iraq to give them to repay their debts. And Saddam Hussein is saying, nope, I'm not repaying your debts. In fact, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to say that you guys are overproducing oil for OPEC and arbitrarily and artificially driving oil prices down. And so they're having conflict between those two countries, and Saddam Hussein is effectively just trying to get out of paying debt. And he's going into kind of having this conversation about, okay, well, if you don't reduce your oil production, then we're going to take military action against you. But if you just pay us $10 billion, then we won't take this military action against you. Kuwait comes back and says, hey, we'll pay you $500 million. We're not going to pay any B's, but we'll pay some M's. And Saddam doesn't appreciate that. And on the 2nd of August, he invades Kuwait. And so he drives across the line, puts about 30,000 troops across into Kuwait, and they march and set up a puppet government. It takes them 2 days, 3 days to pretty much own Kuwait at that point. Yep. And so as kind of that is, and then what I also kind of learned was the fact that Saddam, in the back of his mind, this wasn't always about oil, but he wanted the Ottoman Empire back, which Kuwait was part of Iraq during that Ottoman Empire, and he wanted to expand his own influence. So he used a little bit of sleight of hand to just try to say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and renege on what the British kind of drew up after the Ottoman Empire fell, and I'm going to try to take this back little by little. Obviously, George Bush 1 doesn't love that, gets a NATO coalition, and we start kind of deploying just like you're talking about. And we put jets and troops into Bahrain, and we put them into Saudi Arabia. We build up that coalition, which little known is something that I found interesting is Afghanistan fought on our side. Afghanistan was part of that coalition. And now it's 593,000 American troops, 270,000 NATO and coalition troops. And here we are. So now we got, Captain Curly Pence shows up in theater, and leading up to theater, when you guys would go out and train, would you consider hey, we're going to fly an Iraq scenario today? Did you guys ever do that, or was it mostly Russian all the way through your career up to this point?
It had always been for what that unit had trained for at that part of the court world. So PACAF, we always trained for North Korea. And even after they invaded on the 2nd, the squadron, I still flew there for 4 more weeks. And we never said back in the weapon shop, hey, let's get a map and put it up of Kuwait, and let's start putting where these SAM systems are, both in Iraq and Kuwait. Let's make a map and see what intel can get and build for us. When I got to Germany, and I was there for 2 months, and I was over in the 480th, and that's a whole different story. But when we deployed, the jets with the red tails on them became yellow tails, and we all became, because they had made it 24 UE. They took the 12 from the 480th and the 12 from the 81st, and then we were all yellow tails down in the desert. But even back in Germany, knowing that some other guys were going to have to go down to the theater, and eventually it was all the F-4Gs. The remaining squadron, 23rd, went to Turkey for the war. But nobody was wandering around going, okay, we're going to fly tactics for that. We just kept training for what we had always done there with that. We kind of put out some 2s and 3s in different places, but nothing, hey, this is all based on the new AOR Korea or Iraq.
Okay. And then leading up, and then once you get kind of into theaters, obviously when you guys don't necessarily train to that country, when you showed up and then were deploying into the conflict, what had Intel told you guys about the threat? Like, what was your perception of the Iraqi MEZ, if you will, missile engagement zone, like going into theater? Like, just from a Weasel perspective, what did you guys expect?
We expected them to fight pretty hard. Like as I said in the early beginning, they had 2s, 3s, 6s, and 8s, and they had a strong quantity of those, along with radar-guided AAA. So as you realized, hey, we're getting ready to go down there, you started really studying those 4 primary, along with the 57 millimeter and the Zeus 23. That would be your primary 6, and then maybe a high finder and some other locating radars. But that became your real portfolio of what to study. And you already knew them. You knew them from the Wild Weasel training course. You knew them from what you always go back in the vault and study. But now you were more interested is, where is this thing sitting on planet Earth in this AOR? And they were good. They had a lot of manpower at their fingertip. A lot of it they got out of the prisons. And so they would even move an SA-2 in hours, where you used to think that an SA-2 was going to be there in semi-permanent. Well, now it was semi-mobile. And yeah, it took them a few hours to break it down and move it. But if they knew they needed to move, they were on the prowl to maybe get up and go. At the beginning of the conflict, they were semi-permanent, but then they learned the hard way that when we found them, it wasn't going to last.
Were they kind of, this is kind of jumping now post-war, like your looking back assessment, do you think, did they operate in the same manner as the Vietnamese kind of operate there, like Russian trained? Did you feel that they were Russian trained, or did you feel like they bought them and then they just kind of operated them in a different manner in which you had trained to in the past or leading up to the conflict?
I think they had some Russian training. And in my job that I just finished from about 6 or 7 years ago, I had the most unique experience that for a full 3 days, and then later I picked up some more work, and for another 3 days, I flew with a gentleman, same age as me. He'd graduated from the USSR Air Academy, went through pilot training in the USSR in 1983, graduated in 84, and then flew MiG-21s, was an instructor in MiG-21s, and then his next assignment after those 2 MiG-21 assignments was to go to Iraq at Saddam's hometown at their Air Academy and be an instructor teaching the young cadets at their Air Academy how to fly. And so when we talked about the flying in Iraq, they had AAA pits that fired at anything. And so he would take a student out, and I told him about this one AAA pit that I had seen firing during the conflict, and it marked the location because the guy was always firing and nobody would bomb him. And he said, that thing shot at me all the time when I had a student on a low-level training flight. So it was the wildest thing. So, hearing stories about how they trained in the MiG-21 in the Soviet country, then how they employed it. And looking back, they employed the SA-2s, very similar to it. I got to go into Kuwait to recapture some of their stuff and bring it back for us in late March of 91, and went to an SA-2 radar site and went to a 57 millimeter big gun emplacement. There were 3 guns there. And the van for that SA-2, it had a steel frame, and then it had plywood sides and a plywood roof. and the electronic equipment inside with tubes and round dials. So, I mean, they had not upgraded that equipment since the day it was made.
Oh, man. Probably back in the mid-50s after the SA-1. But didn't work out so hot for the Russians, but lethal threat. Wow.
Oh, very, very lethal, and we respected it.
Like in reality, like, oh yeah.
I had
all right,
fourth day of the war, I had 3 SA-2 missiles fired at my aircraft from the same site, a volley fired. And the lead, I looked out front, I couldn't keep up with them, and I told my backseater, I said, it looks like he's doing the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. And he said, what? And I said, he's defensive for something, and there's nothing on our raw scope. And I'm watching him, and we were over Baghdad, and his airplane was all over the sky. And all of a sudden, he keyed the mic, and he said, SA-2s, left 7 low. And I rolled to my left, upside down, and looked. And all of a sudden, something that had never happened before in all my flying, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And you could feel it. And man, I couldn't see the SAMs, but I could feel them coming. And I rolled that plane 180 degrees to the right, and now I'm in a 90-degree right bank, and I brake as hard as I can. And I make it 180 degrees around the circle, and I look back across where I was, and 3 missiles exploded. Bang, bang, bang. And I could see them explode in the air, right where I had been. And they were tracing him, but they were optically firing on me. Because he was 3 or 4 miles further south. So they were firing on where I was. And right then, as the missiles exploded, now I get locked onto by the SA-2. And all I did was I brought it right to the nose, like I told you earlier in training. And he took that diamond cue and put it right on there. And I said, you are cleared to fire. And we put one right down his throat. And then I said, where is the nearest threat to the target array? Because we were going to the Salman Pak Kim Bio, actually to the nuclear facility, that attack. So we were in southern Baghdad for their nuke facility, and we had an 80 package of strikers and weasels and air-to-air. And he put the cursor over that and said, there's an SA-6. And I said, you're cleared to fire. And he targeted the 6. And because of gas on board, we only had 2 arms. And then we turned. By then, I had been, again, defending for other stuff, and I was down to 15,000. And the AAA was going off all around us. You could have walked home on it. So we started climbing out of the AAA. But that was a busy afternoon with even an SA-2 you had to respect.
Yeah.
And then you had to respect the AAA.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's so when you guys were going in and you're talking about going to the nuke facility, what was your guys' typical strike package that you guys would go with as far as, let's say it took 8 jets, either like if you're going after with bombers or anything like that.
Flash.
But when you had a strike package, what did that generally look like? Would you have a certain number of strikers and then like a ratio of weasels and some air-to-air escort? What did that strike package look like?
In Desert Storm, it depended on the priority of the target. And I'll give you 2 quick examples. The very first night, when we went to Baghdad the first night, and at the end of the first hour, H hour was 0300, and as the first F-117 flew north to south over Baghdad and took out the ATT facility to cut the wires from the 4 air defense sectors going into the main SOC. Now, to make each of the 4 air sectors autonomous from each other, they had 24 Wild Weasels, or they had 12 from the George Squadron, the 561st, and they had 12 from the U.S. Navy. And if you were to draw a 30-mile ring around Baghdad, they had the F-4Gs on one side and they had the U.S. Navy on the other side. And as they came to that 30-mile ring, just minutes prior to H hour, every jet fired 2 missiles off of its rails. So you had 24 missiles and 24 missiles going into the heart of Baghdad. And unbeknownst to anybody, what they had done to help the tactic work was they'd taken 37 drones from the Vietnam era out of the boneyard. And they'd gotten the motors working, and they'd reprogrammed them with a flight path, and they'd lined them up on the southern border of Iraq. And then they launched them at 45 minutes prior to minute 1, which was the flight time to fly from the Iraqi-Saudi border into that circle. And then they had a zigzag pattern. They weren't going to bomb a certain target, but they were up there to fly around like a bunch of airplanes were inside the 30-mile circle. So now all the radars turn on. They're expecting us. And now there's all these aircraft flying around, but they weren't manned aircraft. They were unmanned drones. You know, like the clown in the rodeo saying, "Look at me for the bull." And so now they're locking onto these drones and shooting them down, meaning the radar was on, and now these missiles have something to home on through the time of flight. So that was how we poked out a lot of eyes in the first minutes of that. And that was with 24 airplanes to get the first airplane across target. And now 55 minutes later, we show up with an 8-ship of Wild Weasels from our squadron to go to the Salman Pak Kim Bio facility, the number 3 target of the first night. And that one had 2 F-117s and 4 F-111s. And the F-117s were medium altitude for their system. And the 4 F-111s were low altitude, Vietnam tactic, coming in below everything and then doing a pop-up, release weapons, laze the target, and hit their dippies, and then drop down, and they egress again at 100 feet at night, going south out of Baghdad until they're clear of all the threats and then climb up. So inside that 30-mile ring, they were low, the F-117s were high, and we had very specific targeting. So unlike the previous with the 12 and 12 aircraft, where they were targeting whatever was on the air, we had, based on what we were told from that strike package lead, each airplane had 2 specific SAMs to take out, and none of them overlapped anybody else. So 8 aircraft, 2 missiles, 16 systems, and they knew how they wanted to get in and get out. And there was that many systems that was with the hole that we were cutting for them was with those. So everybody had a specific role to play to help those 6 strike aircraft get in and out. There were no other air-to-air assets or anything on it. The air-to-air was in other caps. One of the aircraft got shot down right underneath our formation going in that night. One of the first 4 aircraft that evening that gets shot down was right underneath our formation going in. I think it was at about 12,000 feet. We were up at 24,000 feet, like I said earlier. It was an interesting evening with everything going on, but then 3 or 4 days later, when we went back to the nuke facility, that fell back more like a Red Flag or a Cope Thunder mission, where they built the package with 60 strikers. We had EF-111s to jam. We had a good 8-ship at least of F-15Cs. But the Weasels pushed out in front of even the air-to-air to get there to set up the orbit, to get the strike, start taking things out. And that one, we had 4 F-4Gs in the first wave. We were in front of the strikers. And then behind us was going to be 4 more F-4Gs kind of getting in there at about mid-part. But by the time we had gotten over target, fired our arms, and then egressed, when I finished with what I had going on, the other 3 aircraft in the formation, they were south of me by 10 to 15 miles after I got out of that AAA and climbed up, and I rejoined. And the other 4-ship was a little bit late getting there. The tankers, there was 2 F-16s shot down in that strike package in Baghdad that afternoon. When they heard one guy on the radio asking for help, they thought maybe he would be limping out. And so the tankers came north out of their tanker tracks in Saudi Arabia. And when the code Mode 2 matched on our scope, we said, well, there's our tankers in Iraq. So we turned and rejoined as they were going north to think they could help somebody out, got our gas to go home in Iraq, and then peeled off that tanker and then went on home that night. And the other 4 ship from the sister squadron, they flew right by them going, what are those tankers doing in Iraq? And they had to divert and spend the night somewhere else. So they never did make it home that afternoon. It was wild. I'm telling you, airplanes were everywhere. It was a lot of it. That 1 week prior to the war kicking off, we did a practice first night. And that night, our practice mission was 6.5 hours long. We hit 3 tanker tracks to exercise to get to our target, do our harm shots, rejoin, get 2 more tankers, go home. And they lost 2 airplanes. Guys got vertigo and accidentally flew into the ground at medium altitude, not necessarily low altitude attack, but just from the chaos that goes on in training that you don't get back home on a day-to-day basis with that many planes in the air at one time.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's interesting that you guys like in country had a training missions, kind of a rehearsal to kind of get into there. That's and wild, like first night, was that one where the story you're just telling that you said it was 4 days, like you said 4th mission or 4 days in country?
That was when I talked about with the 60 aircraft strike package. That was that was day 4 of the war, going into the nuke facility in Baghdad to take that target out. So, we were falling back on our tactics that we had practiced in red flag, green flag, and Cope Thunder.
Yeah. That's what that's what you do, right? Is like you just fall back on your training, like especially if you're not exactly sure of the threat, like how this is going to go. Are they going to act like they do in training? Is it going to look like our intel told us? Is it going to feel like a red flag, kind of a Cope Thunder? You just don't know these things until you're there, and not something that I've had to experience. That's why I'm talking to you and getting it from firsthand accounts. But that's kind of the thing, is like you're just not going to know exactly what it's like until you're actually there, and like you're not. I'm a big believer that you do in fact kind of rise to the occasion, if you will. But when you rise to the occasion, how do you rise to the occasion? Is you fall back on preparation, and it seems like you guys were pretty well prepared to go out and accomplish this. So as far as just like a quick systems question, when you guys are talking about again for our listeners, is that's not new, and that's not necessarily old either. Like what Curly was talking about is when you're going out to do SEAD, is you have to have a stimulation effect. If you don't have a stimulation effect, that was something that was learned into Desert Storm is, hey, let's go ahead and throw some drones out there that look like a strike package, get these things to turn on. And then it sounds like you guys were taking preemptive and proactive harm shots into the target area, as far as just like what you guys were going to kind of to prep the battle space, and then push the strike package in there now with a little bit more SA. So that's not new, because contrary to maybe some of the weasels of today, SAMs turn on to shoot you. They don't turn on for you to find them and kill them. That is what they are going to do. So you need to put something into the envelope that's going to actually entice them to radiate to actually kill something. And then now hopefully you're there and present for the geolocation. So as far as the systems that you guys had, you're talking about like APR 38s and your guy and your EWO in the back seat, or your Rio or Wizzo, as you guys were calling them, the evolution of that is how accurate could they get when they're moving that on your scope? How accurate was it? Like once they would put it on there and then you'd point the nose and shoot, about plus or minus off the nose where you're getting with that system.
Well, it could be very, very accurate.
Okay.
The system just needed a number of hits. So we marked it. If you could fly on the closer, you could put a radar on your beam to one side of the aircraft. On that old F4G, we had 52 antennas. And if you put the aircraft to the beam, then from the nose to the tail, there might be as many as 26 of those 52 that were absorbing different electrons. And by able to do that versus the nose of the plane, which then has a real small aperture to that for antennas, now you're going to collect a lot more data. And man, on the beam, you could take something from a poor range quality to a real high within 1% of accuracy within seconds. And then it'll hold it, and you can turn to the nose and fire the weapon. So we'd be driving in on the nose, but if you started working something, you might, just similar to air, there's a lot of similarities with air to air. You might check 30 or 40 degrees, and now you're still getting close to the guy, but you're giving him your side to look at, where really your antennas are picking up electrons, and it's helping the guy in the back work the system to give the system information to get a better, higher range quality on that. So now you've got a good resolution for firing solution. Now you come back to the nose and you can fire that missile. And again, are you really far outside the ring, on the edge of the ring, or are you inside the ring? Where are you at? But the sooner you can get that information, the sooner you get that. And then we like to get right up to the edge of that ring or just inside and fire it, because it shortens the time of flight, and the shorter time of flight gives him less time to react and a better chance of getting a free lunch from us. So, we'd like to give him all the warmth we can from our heart with that hot lead.
Yeah. And that's kind of when I was learning SEAD with the harm, is short harm time of flight was right. the goal. Is either you're taking a preemptive or a proactive shot at a specific range to the strike package, to where as this is going in, hopefully that thing turns on for the first time while the harm is already in flight. And then if you can't do that, then now what you're looking to do is you're trying to catch them as early as you can in their engagement timeline and get that harm off the rail to be able to actually fit it while it's still trying to shoot someone down. Because as it's going, is you don't want that thing to turn off. Like, you want them to attempt to complete an entire engagement, because that's the longest they're ever going to radiate. And so that's what was taught to me. And it sounds like that was exactly what you guys were taught at the advent of putting harms on the jet.
That's right. And today it's no different. You've got some different weapons, but if you have to throw a harm out there, their radar will pick it up. And then now he's got a small target, but turn on and fire at it. But if he's got to stay on the air for 30 or 40 seconds, man, that gives you all the time in the world to get what you need. So
that's right.
Spend the money.
Would you guys
hesitate to
would you guys
spend the money?
Okay. Spend the money. You don't have a weapon stay problem until you have one.
That's right.
Yeah. But would you guys follow up like off the F4, or would you guys have other kind of like going in as not necessarily, because you guys were the hunters and the killers for the most part. Like, you didn't necessarily need to have the finding and fixing platform and then the targeting and engaging platform. You guys were kind of both. Would you guys follow up these harms? Do you have bombs on the jet to go in with like either CBU or Maverick, as you kind of were talking about it? Would you guys have a mixed loadout of the Weasels that were actually going to fire a harm, more of a suppressive weapon that could in fact kill the thing if it hit it? And then would you go follow it up with bombs, or would you leave that to something else?
We'd leave that to something else. Down at Sheikh Issa, we had harms, and then the last week of the war, they broke out the Shrikes, and the guy said, "This is stupid. We can't see anything with that frequency band." Up north, out of Incirlik, they went into the weapons ammo dump, and they said, "Hey, we got all these Mavericks." And so the guy said, "Well, give us one of those. We'll take that too." So they're flying around with a harm and a Maverick, and then they're coming home going, "Hey, watch this on the tape. I put a hole in the observatory at the astronomy place," and they're flying out shooting things that weren't SAM systems with these Mavericks in Iraq. So, okay, they're having a little fun shooting Mavericks, but they weren't necessarily taking out SEAD-related targets in the enemy country. So, at post-Desert Storm, we got more and more to harm only. None of the games with the Shrike. Back home when training, we would occasionally train with Maverick missile. So we never stopped training with it. It's still a formidable missile to use, but you better hope that the guy's on his last leg and can't really shoot back at you, because you're going to be getting deep in the heart when that's coming off the rail. Especially
that B model Maverick, potentially what you guys carrying, or leaving the night Mavericks, the Ds and the Gs, to the Augs, going out there at night trying to find something and killing tanks on Highway of Death and things like that. But no, that's awesome. Like and then would you guys, because I know we talked about it, would you guys follow up any harm shots with gun? Like, would you recommend going in and strafing a fan saw? Oh, you didn't? Yeah, I was gonna say, did you guys ever put it, load it up, or was that left to some of the other F4s going and doing strikes?
The only F4s in Desert Storm were the F4G Wild Weasels. So by the time Desert Storm kicked off, there was F4G Wild Weasels. There was a couple of squadrons left in the Air Force with RF4s, and so they had a mixed squadron down at Sheikh Giza with 12 RF4s from Bergstrom Air Force Base, active duty, and 12 RF4Cs out of Reno, Nevada. And those 24 RF4Cs were about the match for airborne aircraft with photographing capability to go do post-strike pictures and stuff. But the rest of it was somewhere else. But the only F4s were F4Gs, no air-to-ground units in the F4.
Love that.
They'd all been retired.
So with you guys, and then now when you guys are, so you have your system, your cut angles get a very tight range cube, be able to turn and shoot that thing. Is now, would you actually hand off a frequency to the harm, or now when you shoot that missile, it just has its database? Because I know the advent of the harm targeting system that we've talked about that went on kind of the Vipers later on, you guys didn't have that. So how would the harm get its frequency range, or was that just pre-built into the harm in general?
Well, the harm has a library built into it.
Yeah.
But what we had built into the F4G and then to the upgraded from the APR-38 to the APR-47, we had an improved processor there when we were flying in Desert Storm that we would tailor to the 2, the 3, the 6, the 8, to the AAA radars and to those height finder radars, so that when we got ready to pickle off a harm, the APR-47 was actually built with the software that would hand off what was the primary frequency we were looking at, where that little diamond had been on the scope. And if the backseater, you'd kind of crew coordinate both with him, but primarily in the flight brief is where the contract was set. Do you fire primary only? Do you fire with the primary and secondary, or primary, secondary, tertiary? And so we would talk about that a lot, so that when we handed off information, did we hand off one, or was there enough other information out there that we didn't need it to try to look for something that might get turned off? And we knew they would turn off. So normally when we handed off information in our system, it handed off, if you were shooting at a 2, well, somewhere in that built in the handoff information from our plane to it before it left the rail was, here's the other on the air, and here in the tertiary, here's the rest that you can go and look for. If you can't find the primary and you can't find the secondary, go look through the whole list and then take your energy and go there. So it was a really beautiful thing in the F4G. It saw everything until we didn't put it in the library. And there were a few things that got hit. The guys would shoot at one system, it would go off the air, and that missile, if it found something else in that damn library, it would use every bit. And the group commander fired a missile, and the threat that him and his backseater fired at turned off. And that missile outperformed even what the textbook said. And they pulled it. It went through a radar and stuck in a generator. And they pulled it out and called back to Riyadh and said, who fired this missile? And they said, who's this? And it was an Army unit, and it had flown out of bad guy country into good guy country and stuck in a friendly radar. And it didn't go off because the battery was dead. And they pulled it out of the side of the van and under the generator, piece of live ordnance, and then read off the serial number. I mean, it went through the radar, left a hole in it, and then went into the generator and stuck. And they pulled it out and read it off. And they went back through the maintenance logbook and they said, hey, that was on tail number 123, and Colonel so-and-so, you flew tail number 123. Why did you shoot this friendly radar?
Oh, man. Yeah, because when we have tactics for that, I mean, the shooting a harm and shutdown, like as far as just like setting min-ac range to 0 or whatever, and not allowing it to go through its library, just like you're talking about, like primary, secondary, and tertiaries. We did this exact same thing. Not 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 years later, like as far as just like how we shoot the arm, it's the exact same way. It's like, I want that thing to hit what I want it to hit, because if I allow it to, like, that thing will glide and that dog will hunt. And
it'll hunt.
So it'll hunt. So that's awesome. All right. So we're kind of getting to, like, you're now, like, we're in there. We figured out like how we're killing SAMs now, like that with the harm and things like that. So tell us, just go with stories. Like we, as far as our listeners are concerned, a little bit of Curly, I'll tell it so you don't have to. But kind of from your bio, it's 5 confirmed radar kills, and then post-war with the rest of your career, kind of working on the air staff for the Kosovo conflict and Allied force, and then finishing up in Strike Eagles. But with some of these, with these confirmed radar kills, tell us about it. Go with story if you could.
I meant to go grab my notebook because it was interesting how post-conflict, you thought you'd hit certain radars, and a couple guys got together in the back of a tent, and they sat down and went through everybody's stuff, and they looked at matching date and times that stuff was supposedly confirmed kill or it never was seen admitted again, and they divvied out who got what kills. So you're thinking that you were more effective, and you watched a system, not just when you pickled a missile. So if you went and shot at a SA-2, and then you turned to the beam because you were deep in its WES, you just didn't quit paying attention to it. You watched to see and kind of watched the stop hand on your watch. Hey, did that thing stay on the air and keep shooting at other people, or did it turn off? Did it ever turn back on? And we even had a system on the ground that we could go to. I was flying in the middle of the night, so I'd go in there and review it for a half hour, 40 minutes before we did our flight briefs. And it was called Constant Source. And we could look at that thing and see what has been on in the last 24 hours, last 6 hours, last 3 hours. So as you built your lineup card and you knew what area you were going to for the target, you knew what threats were working and had been on the air in the last number, 24 hours, 12 hours, 6 hours. So you started to build your focus really on what possibly could be the real threat where we're going tonight. And so now at the end of the conflict, they go, well, you got 2. You got 2. I know I was doing better than that. And a few months later, more than months, but as we got into 92 and Saddam went back to Kuwait, and then we got yanked in, and then Saddam pulled some more stuff, and we stayed. And then in 93, they pulled me in before I PCS to Nellis, and we were there for 3 months. And they wanted something to happen. And so I used the same tactics we had done and we were talking about there. And I went out, and in about 4 days, I fired 3 missiles, and bam, bam, bam. Each one was a hit on different radars, including the SA-6. So I kind of looked back on that and I said, okay, 3 more confirmed kills. They gave me 2 before. This comes up to 5. But the way we were shooting back there, I didn't change my tactics. We really worked to that range quality 2, range quality 1 before we hit the pick button. So I can't confirm or deny that I got maybe more back there, but that was just how they handed out what they handed out. But they had very good intel to confirm what got hit during that 1 week of things going on with George Bush Sr. before he left office. And it was no kidding. 1-to-1 on shooting. So 3 harms, got 3 kills. And then had an F-16 on the last one that was carrying CBU. And we employed the tactic where we did hunter killer. So I fired the harm, and he went hot. And then the second missile was ready to defend him if anything else popped up while he went in to drop on that radar. And when he dropped, he said the radar area where we had given him the coordinates, there was a fire going from the missile hit. And then he dropped Kansas CBU. And so not just the radar, but the rest of that whole radar site was pretty much toast. I know from walking, because I walked through a radar site in Kuwait. It was an SA-2 site. And we had a Marine EOD specialist with us, a staff sergeant. And when we got ready to get out of the vehicles to go get that van and get 2 SA-2 radar dishes there, he told us to be real careful. He said there'd been a couple of sandstorms, and this place was bombed heavily by the A-10s with CBU. So there's some unexploded ordnance just under the edge of the sand. So don't be kicking the ground as you walk. Be careful how you step. So we were walking on top of areas where there was unexploded ordnance. So it was kind of a touchy thing, but yeah, it's out there. It's real. So when you drop Kansas CBU, you'll take it out, but you'll also leave problems for them for months to come, which is a good thing.
There you go. Well, I'm going to say it. You hear that, Air Force? The A-10 was out there dropping bombs on SAMs too. So, doing SEAD as well. But so as far as the targets that you guys, obviously you're going after 2s, 3s, 6s, and 8s, and the TTRs associated with each one. But you're also talking about AAA radars, height finders. So just the IADs, if you will. So like whatever the IADs was going after. Were you guys exploring tactics? Because I know in Vietnam they were saying if we would have shot more or destroyed more of the height finders and range finders and some of the AC radars associated with some of these threats, we could have saved a few more pilots. Did you guys go out there deliberately targeting some of those radars as well? Or would you guys kind of save the harms for the TTRs? Or was it a little bit of mix of both depending on what mission you were doing?
Those last 3 kills, 2 of them were height finders, because they had 1 SA-2 and then they had 3 SA-6s. They're north of the 36th and the northern AOR for the no-fly zone in 93. So by all means, and in fact, in Desert Storm, if you could find one of those on, it was fair game. It's kind of like in World War II, and the guy said, I shot down 2 Messerschmitts today, but then there was a twin-engine Betty flying through the air, and it had a big old German swastika, and I shot it down too. So same thing with radars. If it's in Iraq or in your AOR and it's emitting, well, it's trying to supply information in some way, shape, or form. And if that, whether it goes back to the SOC or right directly wired to the nearest SAM system, every time you can take another eye out, take it out. Air superior, what your Weasel mission does today is air superiority. We're not fluent Tegu in the air-to-air squadron. We talked about, we're going to provide air superiority. But I've thought about that term since that first tour. And today, a lot of enemies don't have an air force. It is very, very expensive to have an air force with fighters. So for the United States to have the fighters it has, that's an expensive endeavor. And you look at nations out there like Iran, Syria, Russia, they have gotten smaller and smaller. North Korea, smaller on an air force and more on the SAM system. The SA-300, 400, I said for Iraq, if we ever had to go back, all he needed was 5 SA-300s to have air superiority against us. So now your problem is he can see you, and it's a harder problem for us to solve than it was with the 2s, 3s, 6s, and 8s. So now to get air superiority over that, you've got to take them out. If you look at what happened in Iran, and as Israel went in there, they took out 1, and then they went back about a month later and took out the next 3, and they achieved air superiority. And they can roam those skies with immunity to do whatever they want. So that's the goal of SEAD, is to give those strikers immunity from everything else to carry out that mission. And the sooner you achieve air superiority with the Weasel mission, which is imperative, that you, both the Navy, the Air Force, and the fighter jets going in and hauling iron can strike and take out targets that will now bring that enemy to his knees.
And the Army, because in Desert Storm is after the 38-day air war, when the Army rolled through Kuwait and then rolled Saddam the forces back into Iraq. That was the desired end state, right? Was just get Iraq out of Kuwait. Was get the Army out of Kuwait. It's like generally we find that conflicts aren't won completely with air superiority by just aerial bombing itself, as we push people back across the line and then hold ground. Is air superiority is obviously going to help that endeavor as well and keep us air to ground casualty free since 1953 as the United States military, if you will, is imperative having air superiority as well. So like being able to actually have that allows the Army to just continue their mission, the Marines, and be able to roll forces back across lines and actually hold ground is important for having air superiority as well. And the Weasels do that because then now you can effectively provide close air support if those guys are not being shot at by SAMs all over the place as well. And Army getting to use their rotary wing, all the above is definitely supported by the Weasel mission, if you will. So awesome,
the Weasel mission
stuff.
Is real important.
Yep. And it's different. It's just like you were talking about S3s, S400s, and Chinese systems and things like that. Is Russia was the only surface-to-air missile game in town for a long time, and so we had a lot of data on 2s and 3s and 6s and 8s, and now as those systems are getting phased out and becoming more robust, but now every country knows how America fights and has a lot of their own indigenously produced surface-to-air missile systems and AAA systems, and how they connect that together makes the Weasel mission just that more difficult. But it's still the same concepts that you guys executed back in the day. Is you knew that you needed to potentially poke an eye out with the ASV radars and then go bomb buildings that brought all the picture together with C2 facilities and things like that, to now kind of, as far as systematically degrade the IADs, which the SEAD definition is just degrade or destroy ground or surface-based air defense systems via destructive or disruptive means. Is you guys did that whatever way you had to do it, and were very successful at it, and that is carried forward to even what we see today. Is the same process occurs to actually do that, and how it's important for some of these A2AD environments that we find ourselves in kind of across the world. So as far as when we're kind of looking at some of the things of going forward, is now your post-conflict. I know we have Blink and Sop, who's going to tell us about Allied Force, but you were there kind of planning the follow-on shooting war of Allied Force and into Kosovo. What lessons did the Weasels of Desert Storm pass on before you ended up retiring? But like, what did you see as the evolution post Desert Storm? And then what did you guys pass on that you saw, hey, this is now different and we need to do something actually different? Or was it similar enough that you guys were able to just tweak the tactics enough as far as the F-16s kind of coming online, taking over the Weasel mission, that you then kind of passed down, if you will, from one Weasel generation to another?
That first transition from the F4G Wild Weasel over to the F-16C Block 50s carrying the harm and having that special pod, the backseaters, our EWOs, the guy showed up at Nellis and said, hey, we'd like a lot of help. We don't understand how to do this, and you're kind of corporate knowledge right now, so take a look at our books, tell us how this thing really works, what is it we really should study, and then help us develop some tactics based on what you see are the strengths and weaknesses of our system. So the EWOs all dove into their books, read through how their system worked, sat down, armchair quarterback, okay, if we had this system and it was on our plane, how would we use it to collect data? How would we use it to get a good range quality? How would we get our shot off? And then studied the libraries of information. And there were 2 or 3 big things that came out in that C model that they said, you've got a nice pod and it's great for this 179 degrees, but you get outside that window and you're blind. So you're going to end up having to fly a pattern like this. And we kind of called it the taco pattern, so that they could work their way around and keep something, within the edge of what the pod could see and collect data and build a picture and give them a targeting solution. But the limb fact really became, how well did they prepare before they stepped to fly? So if you made a finger mistake or didn't program it with all of the possible threat arrays that could be in that theater, and you left something out, and that one thing is the only thing on the radar that night, and then your system's not going to see it because you didn't put it in there. So it was just the 180 backwards, where ours had everything and we took stuff out. Y'all said, or the C model community had 0 until they put it in there. So they had to build it right. So there ended up being occasionally EWOs who'd get sent to help one of those squadrons out. I don't know if they were there in the Kosovo conflict. I know one close acquaintance had told me post-conflict, he said, those guys fired 700 harms and got 3 hits. I don't know if that's a true fact or if it was just a word of mouth thing, but I think that they could have been more effective if they'd have kept some of those backseaters employed, working with those squadrons, or even putting them in the tub to go in there and help those guys be more effective in their strike back use. Because there was a 117 shot down, and then there was a couple F-16s lost. That had we'd done that with the F-4Gs, it would have been a completely different story of the way we thought and worked. I mean, that was our signature on the line, was we were going to go in and protect those guys. So but you got to see it to kill it.
Yeah. Yep. And that's kind of the thing is like, as the HTS, the harm targeting system kind of came along, is I mean, you sit there at the computer and you build the table like every day. In Desert Storm, you alluded to it, but did you guys have any ROE like restrictions on you, like what you could kill, what you could shoot, or was it's in Iraq, it's bad, I can kill it?
It's in Iraq and it's on your, they kill it.
All right. No, that's because that was the addition where, like, again, we're going to talk to Blank, and we're going to get that, is like there was a little bit of that as far as ROE and restriction, like in Allied force, and the harm effectiveness was significantly lower in Allied force as we kind of go, and whether that was a function of tactics, whether that was a function of restriction, whether it was a function of system, we're gonna kind of talk about that, because again, these systems are improving. They're all taking the same concepts of see a mission, cut angle, range it in, find a mission, kill system. But as that kind of goes here, it's utilizing the same exact technology roughly, and then kind of going in with the execution of tactics, like you talked about with you shooting a harm as a mark, if you will, and then an F-16 coming in with CBU. I can tell you that in 2024 and 2025, and definitely when I was flying F-16s in 2019, same tactic, like no different. Shoot a harm, follow up with a bomb, kill the rest of the site. Like those things, those same tactics and concepts are alive and well from learning from you guys. And now it's just, how does it apply to this conflict? How does it apply to this threat? And knowing the threat and knowing your jet is kind of the way to do it. So, so we're getting towards the end. I am going to ask, as this is a series, I'm going to ask everyone. I'm not going to tell them I'm going to ask everyone. But from Curly's perspective, across all the different conflicts, if you were to say, how do you kill a SAM from Curly's perspective? What is the best way to do it? How you did it, either through personal example or just here's the best way to kill a SAM. What would you say?
Know your system. Know it with your eyes closed, how it's going to work, how you're going to get the best information, and then how to take that weapon on your wing, under your right wing, left wing, or center line, and then using that system, employ that to the 99 percentile capability to try and kill that on the first shot. It's no different than a street fight. If you're going to get a shot, that first punch better hit dead center if you think you're going to win that fight. So in the air, when you get there, know your system. So whatever shows up, if you can, turn and put that ordnance to the best of your ability on that target as quick. Sometimes you'll never get a second chance. And that's, if you don't get it there and then a striker comes in and gets shot down, you're going to feel pretty bad that you didn't get that first shot and be effective to take that guy out. Because the strikers they're not going to go loiter until you say, well, okay, everything's dead. No, they're moving at the same speed you're moving. So know your system, get that shot, kill that guy. That doesn't mean that he's not going to wait until that guy's rolling in on the target. Now he turns on. Case in point, here to tie it together with the war story, we were supporting the 12 ship of Tornadoes on the west side of Baghdad on the 14th of February. And so here it is, St. Valentine's Day, and the Brits are flying the exact same ground track, 1 through 12, in on the target. And there's an SA-3 at the radars, at the target area. And at one point, my wingman, I looked over and again, here he is doing the Sugar Plum Ferry again. I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And he goes, I'm targeted by an SA-3. He's 6,000 feet off my right wing. I can see him right now off to the side. Clear blue sky day, couple of clouds in the air, and it's not targeting me. That pencil beam on that 3 was locked to him, and there was no bleed over with any beams coming to us. We couldn't get any data to turn and shoot. They didn't fire on him, but a little bit later, as those Tornadoes were in, the number 1's in, 2's in, 3's in, 4's in, 12's in, 11's going to do a re-attack. And as 11 comes and does his re-attack, that SA-3 turns on, locks onto him, and fires. And it was on air enough with the search radar that one of the guys picked it up, and they turned and fired, but it was not effective by the time the harm got there for 2 reasons. One, his missile had already timed out and killed the Tornado and the crew in it. 2, as you know, there's a TDD built into that harm. Well, what had they done with the 3? That 3 was buried in the sand, 20 feet. So the radar was just sticking its little head out above the sand, as opposed to the bottom of the system sitting on the flat surface of the sand, and the radar up here, they've buried it 20, 25 feet down. And now when the TDD tells the missile to go off, it misses the radar because the radar's down here and the frag flies by it. So the enemy got smart, and our OODA loop wasn't built to get imagery quick enough on how these things are operating. What I tried to do pre-Kosovo was to get us to tie it into some national assets back in D.C. that collected all of the data so that we could get electronic fingerprints. So you've got a fingerprint, I've got a fingerprint. We all have a fingerprint. It's in an FBI database. Well, when those SA-300s are built, SA-400s and SA-whatevers are being built, everybody has an electronic fingerprint. And when you can get that electronic fingerprint on that and now work with that national asset to track that over a period of time, you can find the 1 or 2 places the crew likes to move that unit to. It parks here, it parks here, it parks here. What we were finding was the SA-6s from the bad guys there at Kosovo conflict, they each had 3 locations they wanted to go to. So if you wanted to carry hard ordnance and take that out, let's build those 3 parking spots into our database. Let's start getting inside his OODA loop for where he's at. So when he's not on the air, but you know where he's parked, you can still target that guy. And if you can target him with a different asset versus an expensive aircraft out of the Air Force or a pilot made a machine, then you're still going to be effective on air superiority taking them out. So it's using all of our resources, and we've got great resources, but SEAD is an important concept to that air superiority. So you've got to think like that operator. And the sooner you think like he does, the easier it is to kill him, because now you know his habits. And so I give you that, at the closing of your show is, work with your intel assets and don't take no for an answer. You tell them, I don't care where you got to go in DC, but you bring me back this data. And cut 2 airmen loose and get out of town and don't come back till you got this information.
Absolutely. That's the thing is, all you're trying to do is find and fix this SAM. Like, all I'm trying to do is know where it is, and then I can kill it. And I don't care who finds it. I don't care how you do it. Get it into data. Like, the knowledge is power, if you will. And
it is.
The more you know going into it, is now you are inside their kill chain, and you can go in and you can get the job done. Because now it's like, I've already got a leg up on you, man. I know where you are. I know how you operate. And then I have built a tactic that can, once I know those two things, that is batting high. Like, I'm batting 750, and I can go in and I know I can do it. And then you're confident, and you know that you can go in and hack the mish and kind of go from there. So, all right, the last question I'll ask you, Curly, is before we kind of get out of here. And again, I am so thankful for your time, and again for your service. And your contribution to Weasel history and the Weasel spirit. So thank you so much. But what do you want any listener or current Weasel or anybody that you flew with, like, what do you want the people that are hearing us right now to know about just being a Weasel?
It is a good mission, unlike what those instructors told us back at Homestead. So come in every day and be proud of getting the opportunity to do SEAD, because SEAD is air superiority. And when we achieve air superiority, as you said, it's just not for the Air Force, it's for the Army. And it's a real mission, and you can be winning it and then you can be losing it. So don't get proud because you said, well, they had 4 SA 300s and we killed 4, so the war's over, dewormer, and we're going home. Oh no, it ain't over until the fat lady sinks, and you don't want them to pop up and pull out the 6s and the 3s from the boneyard and then kill a couple of your guys, and now you say, oh shoot, I got to go back to war. No, you want to be ready and when those pop up. So study, that's why we lost that constant source capability. Man, you're going to have to find those other intel resources to tell you, hey, something new popped up. So before you step, you've got the latest and greatest intel at your side. And until DC calls and says, knock it off, somebody's going to be shooting at you. So don't get careless. I've seen it happen late in the war. Somebody gets shot down, and that's no fun.
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate the time, and we'll kind of sign it off here with, again, just a big thank you to you. Thank you to all the Weasels, and we're like, whenever we're having these kind of conversations, we always remember the people that went out to do the Weasel mission and didn't come back. So thank you to those. We will always remember those individuals. And so there you go. But Curly, again, I appreciate you. To all of our supporters of the podcast, thank you for listening. Wherever you're getting this, and I hope that you enjoyed the episode. I truly appreciated the time, Curly, and I hope to talk to you down the road and keep in touch with that. So thank you so much. Over to you for last words.
Thank you for having me, Flash. I think it's great what you're doing.
All right. Thanks, Curly. I appreciate it. All right. For the Afterburn Podcast, I'm Flash. This is Curly. Thanks again for listening, and to the Weasels.